Welcome to another Redwall review. The book we're talking today is Marlfox. Whether you have this edition or one of the American editions of this book always has a striking, haunting cover because it's one of the rare books where like the villain is far more front and center. All we see is this Marlfox. And what is a Marlfox even? I looked up marl at some point because it had never occurred to me, and I think it's a kind of stone, so it refers to the color of these foxes. But the point is, Brian Jacques started this book. He needed a hook. He needed a way to get you in because he's now 11 books deep in this series. So he creates this semi-fictitious group of creatures. Now, are they actually a fictitious species, or are they just foxes with sort of a rare pigmentation? Because all the marl foxes, it turns out, they're on one family. They come from this island ruled by the marl fox queen Sylph. And this book starts as a pair of marl foxes named Askrod and Vannon end up in the vicinity of the series' famous location, Redwall Abbey. So if you watched my last review of a Redwall book, which would have been of The Long Patrol, you would have found I was kind of underwhelmed by how that book went. Brian Jacques kind of gave into his mistake of creating too many characters and kind of forgetting who his main character was. So by the end, it kind of felt like pure action without any of the personality to win you over to it. I think with Marlfox, Brian Jacques did a pretty good job of course correcting those flaws. We have three protagonists who are memorable and have distinct voices throughout the book. Two squirrels named Song and Dan, or short for Songbreeze and Danflor, as well as a shrew named Dippler. And of course, we know who the villains are. They are these marl foxes. One arguable weakness in the book is that it's sort of like many Redwall books, it's split kind of in two, kind of in more than two. So part of the book is the quest of these three young heroes, Song, Dan, and Dippler, to retrieve the tapestry of Martin the Warrior that the marl fox Mokan has stolen from Redwall Abbey. But the other part is the rest of the residents of Redwall Abbey defending the Abbey from the other marl foxes. That part of the book I did not like as much because there's a kind of character in these books that I call the skipper. And the character who is named Skipper, which is the title for leader of the Otters, is just one example of this trope. But basically, a skipper is a character who is like a hyper competent warrior. Like they win every battle they fight. They're ridiculously brave, yet they're also just kind of there. And it's just kind of confusing. You know, what's the point of having heroes in this book if there are all these skipper types around who are, you know, equally or even more competent than the heroes, but kind of bland. So whenever there's a fighting scene at Redwall, it doesn't quite work for me. I do give him credit. This book, compared to the last one, has some strong personalities. You know who the heroes are. You know who the villains are. That's very good. One thing that I thought was a bit of a weakness, and don't take this the wrong way because it's a very subtle difference from the other books, I had a sense this book was a tad more juvenile. Now, granted, all of these books are aimed mostly at an 8 to 12 audience, though they're sort of like tough reads for that audience. And I find they hold up well when you're an adult reader because, you know, the contents are so dark, the prose is so nice that for the most part, they're not the kind of things that are painful to reread. What I felt was a bit juvenile, perhaps, about Marlfox were just like little things in the structure. So one of the themes of this book that I like is the relationship between the sort of new Redwall Abbey warrior, well, not officially, that's kind of his arc in the story, Dan, and his father, Rusvol Rugeba. Rusvol basically yells at Dan early in the book every time he thinks Dan isn't acting like a warrior, isn't as brave as his badass father. And this, you know, gives Dan a real chip on his shoulder. It sets his story off in a good place. It gives him something to prove. And I like that. It makes Dan a more unique character than all the other characters before him who were just like, you know, I want to be a warrior and then I become a warrior. I think the problem with how the Dan and Rusvol plot is handled is A, that it's, you know, not subtle in the way some of the other sort of potentially toxic relationships were earlier in the series. So it's sort of very obvious you're supposed to know that Rusvol's behavior is inappropriate. You're not supposed to figure out that, you know, there's no journey in figuring out that Dan is being treated unfairly. It's just kind of obvious. And on top of that, I feel like even though Dan has a slightly more complicated beginning than other Redwall Abbey warriors, he basically just still has the same arc where he goes out on a journey, he develops as a warrior, and he goes back to the Abbey and he kind of gives his dad a dirty look. Whereas, you know, I feel like a more nuanced arc, kind of like the one we got with the characters of Mara and Earthstrike and Salamandastron, would be Dan kind of develops in his own way. Maybe he doesn't end up a warrior like his father. Maybe he ends up something else like his mother. Apparently, Dan's father and mother debated between whether his full name should be Dan Blood or Dan Flower. One of the most extreme examples of a gender binary in the Redwall universe. And they ended up compromising on the name Dan Floor. So it would have been interesting if the journey was Dan, somehow finding more of his inner Dan Flower in him. But instead, it's just he eventually grows up and becomes competent and is able to say to his dad, "You were wrong for judging me." He's not able to sort of dig deeper into the problems of his dad's worldview. And on the one hand, I really appreciated this as someone who, was bullied by jocks as a kid. And as recently as a couple years ago, I joined a college recreational basketball team, and I was surprised by how mean my, grad school teammates were about me, not being the best at basketball. Like I thought, it's about having fun. It's not about winning. That's something you're supposed to know when you're a little kid. Yet there are all these athletes who are mean to you if you're bad at sports. And I kind of got that vibe from Rustful. So on the one hand, I really like this Rustful versus Dan dynamic. But at the same time, it was certainly less subtle than some of these dynamics were in earlier Redwall books. Another thing that I felt like made this book a tad more juvenile is that it felt like towards the end of the books, the sort of various arcs were wrapped up just by the good characters one by one defeating the bad characters in battle. In the earlier books, Brian Jacques found ways for the bad characters to be defeated indirectly or in a way that felt more thematically relevant. So, in Martin the Warrior and in Outcast of Redwall, the bad guys were defeated, but, only after causing a devastating tragedy. Or in the earlier books like Redwall, Mossflower, Madame Mayo, Marielle of Redwall, the bad guys are not directly defeated by the good guys, but by some sort of force of nature. And the point is, even if the good guys are brave warriors who are theoretically willing to kill, there's something about getting revenge that does not dignify a good character. Whereas in this book, it felt like Brian Jacques didn't have a more clever way to wrap it up. So it's just one by one, the bad guys show up, they have sword fights or whatever with the good guys, and the bad guys lose. So that felt a bit underwhelming. And tied to that was the fact that there wasn't really a tragic death in this book in the way that Brian Jacques managed to bring so brilliantly into his other books. Now, before someone calls me out on this, I should say there are some sort of tragic deaths in here, but the thing is they both happen pretty early in the book. One of them befalls Log-a-Log, and those who've read many Redwall books will know that Log-a-Log is not a name, it is a title. And in pretty much every Redwall book, there is a Log-a-Log who is the leader of the Shrews. And while in some books the Log-a-Log certainly becomes more of a character, for the most part, he's kind of a generic place filler. So sue me if I didn't cry when this, millionth rendition of Log-a-Log died before we really got to know him. And then the other tragic death is an owl named Nutwing. That one is described surprisingly graphically, so I can certainly see that affecting you. And also, Nutwing was a character we saw in the previous book, The Long Patrol. But Nutwing was a very minor character in The Long Patrol. He didn't have any speaking lines, and he's only in the beginning of this book. So it doesn't have the impact of, spoiler alert, Rose dying in Martin the Warrior, or even Russa dying in The Long Patrol. Those felt like deaths that really challenged the reader. Whereas this one just felt more like good guys fight, good guys are cool, good guys win, happy ending, everything's pretty easy. And despite the fact that, I thought this book was sort of like all the Redwall books, written in a way to be compelling in its prose, it did feel like there were little errors in here, almost as if Brian Jacques was thinking about ways to make the story more complicated and then abandoned them. So one such example is a scene that sort of ends with Dippler the shrew crying, and the chapter suddenly ends, and you're thinking, oh, some big tragedy is going to be revealed, something that adds an element of dramatic irony to the victory. But then that thought never gets completed. And there's another moment where, after all the Marlfoxes are defeated, one of the characters says, I think one of the Marlfoxes disappeared. And that thought is never revisited. I kept thinking that he's going to do the thing that he did in his later book, The Tagarung, where he acts like all the bad guys have been killed, but a savvy reader of The Tagarung will go, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure, spoiler alert, Rawback, didn't die. And Brian Jakes is like, aha, you were paying attention. Rawback is still alive. He's going to show up. And I think a similar thing happened. It was like he was about to do a similar thing in Marlfox with surprise, Predak is still alive. And then he just forgot to do that. Those were some of the weaknesses I found with this book. One final weakness I'd like to talk about is a regression from The Long Patrol. And generally, as I said, I found this a more compelling book than The Long Patrol. But one thing I think that Brian Jakes finally figured out with The Long Patrol was how to balance the fact that a lot of his readers probably want sequels to his books where we revisit characters and get to know them better, and his desire to write about different characters every time. And he sort of found the perfect balance in The Long Patrol, where he wrote about some of his characters, say the equivalent of 30 years later, so they're middle-aged rather than young, but there's a bunch of them and there's still major characters in the story, while also having space to introduce a new generation of characters. I thought he was going to do the same thing in Marlfox. Having read a bit about the character of Arvin, I was expecting this to be the conclusion of the Arvin trilogy, where we get baby Arvin in Pearls of Lutra, warrior Arvin in Long Patrol, and abbot Arvin in Marlfox. But instead, it ends up happening that Arvin, being the elderly abbot of Redwall, only takes place in the introduction, and then he's dead by the time the book starts. If they were going to have a tragic elder death in this book, I feel like it should have been Arvin. That was a missed opportunity. Also, weirdly enough, Arvin's two friends are in this book, and it's not Brian Jakes doesn't treat Gerbil and Diggum like they're weirdly old. They're just sort of passively mentioned as if he forgot who those characters were. At the same time, I guess the reason why he set Marlfox later after Long Patrol than he set Long Patrol after Pearls of Lutra was to kind of open Redwall in this sort of time of transition, to present the Abbey as kind of dysfunctional. It doesn't have leadership, and thus it was vulnerable to the attack from the Marlfoxes. So I guess that's what he was going for there. So now let's talk about some strengths in this book. As I said, I felt like the main characters in the story, Song and Dan, were relatively well defined compared to some of the main characters in his other books, as was the shrew, Dippler. One thing I've been thinking about is, of all the books he never got around to writing, why did he never make shrews a main character? And there's easily another timeline where the title of this book is not Marlfox, but Logolog, because it's about how a sort of the journey, well, I guess that's a spoiler, but it's about the journey of a young shrew to the sort of top of the shrew hierarchy. And I don't think it's too bad a spoiler, because it's pretty obvious what's happening if you're reading this as an older reader. I think it's worth mentioning that throughout the series, there has been a sort of progression of characters being introduced who are more and more pacifist after Brian Jakes seemingly made fun of pacifists in his first book. So we saw the development in book 4 of the character Saxtus, who begins to have some pacifist inclinations. We have the first sort of pacifist by principle, says it out loud character of Brome in book 6. And then in book 8, we have Bryony, the first main character who goes on a quest without really using any violence at all and stands alone in arguing for universal mercy and rehabilitative justice in order to defend the young ferret she raised. The character Song the Squirrel feels like the next member of this great pacifist tradition. And what's unique about her is she almost feels like the most morally perfect character Brian Jakes is ever going to create, because he makes clear her pacifism is not an owl, a cover for cowardice or weakness. She always participates in fights, yet whenever she fights someone, she manages to just disarm them, and then she'll like patch up their wounds. And unlike even other pacifist characters who will like heal a villain and then say to them, run away, I never want to see you again, and if I see you again, I'll kill you. Song never directly says that. She just says, please start a peaceful life, please learn to take care of herself. I think she's also the first character in this book we've seen explicitly be sympathetic to fish. I mentioned how in the first few Redwall books, the good characters explicitly went on fishing expeditions, something I didn't love. But then since then, Brian Jakes has subtly phased explicit depictions of fishing out of the series until finally in Pearls of Lutra, we saw some of the same fish in the pond who were previously presented as food and are now sort of presented as sort of big, intimidating fellow residents of Redwall who are lived alongside rather than hunted. And Song is the first character who expresses disgust at fish being killed. I mean, she befriends this fishing eagle, and obviously she understands that this character literally does have to eat fish to survive, but she has to turn her head the other way every time he eats. So that is something we hadn't seen before. Another thing that's cool about this book that he sort of started to do in Long Patrol and then just forgot about a few chapters in is that these characters are explicitly part of families. You know, we see a perfect loving family, which is Song's family with her parents and still living grandparents. We see the sort of toxic masculine single father family, Rusville and Dan. And we also see the villains in a family. The Marlfoxes are all brothers and sisters, and they travel in pairs together. And there's a kind of confusion with the Marlfoxes, because on the one hand, he's trying to portray them as sly foxes, as much more intelligent than the rats they're commanding. But the Marlfoxes, nonetheless, are kind of confused about what their motive is. I mean, they have this manipulative mother who sent them off to steal treasures for her castle, and they just kind of show up and we're like, we're cool, we're evil, and we're going to steal stuff for our mother. But quickly, a tension builds up in the Marlfoxes when one of them, Zyril, is killed. And another one of them, Gelter, or Gelter, I think I'll say Gelter, is like, well, we have to avenge Zyril's death. And Makan, who's the kind of de facto leader of the Marlfoxes, is like, no, you fool, we're here to steal treasure. You know, we're the bad guys. We don't get our revenge. So there's this kind of tension where because the Marlfoxes are a real family, unlike other villains we've seen so far, some of them seem to genuinely love each other. And Brian Jiggs almost pulls off a thing where he kind of writes most of the Marlfoxes, Askarad, Vannon, Kredak, and Gelter as kind of gray characters who are sort of villainous towards the mice, but benevolent towards each other. But he doesn't quite tie up that loose end. And then he sort of ends up making Makan the most prominent Marlfox. And then Makan has this fight with his other sister, Lanter, who's also a cynical individualist. It feels like he's kind of confused. Does he want to have this ensemble family of villains, or does he want to write them like all his other villains where they're all selfish and backstabbing? But yeah, I feel like the tension between, is this an ensemble of morally gray characters, or are they standard Redwall villains? Brian Jiggs isn't sure, and it doesn't end up quite working out. The one thing that does work out is the actual Marlfox Island feels like it's written a bit differently than other villain settings. He does a better job of what he did with the Fox Castle in Bellmaker, where it's kind of portrayed as this medieval society with creepy music. There's some very funny scenes with Makan's younger sister, Lanter, as she's trying to kill her mother and trick her out of power. You know, first dressing up as a ghost and then pretending to be sad by like wearing a Commedia dell'arte crying mask at her funeral. So those are some good moments.
And also, there are some slaves of the Marlfoxes who kind of have like Statler and Waldorf from the Muppet Moments, where they just sort of cynically exchange lines about their situation.
I think one thing maybe I missed in this book is there are a lot of subtle comedic cartoonish elements. Like there's this kind of Looney Tunes moment where a rat kind of crashes into into Redwall Abbey and comes over and, well, you know, Looney Tunes head crush, star spinning around his head kind of thing. There are also a lot of jokes with Florian the Hare being a kind of stuck up military type, even though he's an actor. I feel like Brian Jiggs kind of got confused. Was he writing about an actor hare, or was he writing about one of his military hares? And I guess the problem is when I'm reading a sort of dense action book, I'm reading at kind of one pace. Whereas in order to really appreciate the comedy of those scenes, I had to slow down. So if I were to ever reread this, I might try and pay more attention to those comedy scenes. A final interesting thing with this book, it starts to and then pulls back from adding another true gray character to the Redwall canon. So I'd said earlier, I feel like there are only two truly gray characters in the series up to this point, and that is Packatug the squirrel from Mariel of Redwall and Romska the ferret from the Pearls of Lutra. I've explained that I do not count Blaggett from the Bellmaker as gray because I think he's just good and was born in the wrong place at the wrong time. But we have this one shrew named Fenno, who's a bit of a bullying jerk, and he doesn't like it when his Log-a-Log calls him out. So in the middle of battle, when he's particularly mad at Log-a-Log, on a kind of impulsive move, he throws his rapier and stabs Log-a-Log in the back, killing him. And what really struck me in that scene is Brian Jiggs immediately followed it with a line where he says something along the lines of, Fenno could not believe what he had done. You know, it was kind of recreating the tragic killing scene from the Sting and Johnny Cash song, I Hung My Head. You know, this felt like he was setting us up for a character who's really morally complex. Because, yeah, he's clearly a bad guy. He's a bit of a bully, and he had this impulse to murder in him. But he's also not an absolute stone cold killer. He did not like that he committed that murder. He was horrified by his actions. And then Fenno runs away. And I was expecting Brian Jakes to like quickly pull back from that decision because most of the time when he sets up a character as gray, he sort of finds a way to get rid of them very quickly rather than dealing with that moral complexity. But actually, he keeps Fenno around where he's enslaved by Mock and the Marlfox. And I'm thinking, wow, he has really given Fenno an arc here. He was this bad guy who semi-accidentally becomes a really bad guy. And then he's kind of screwed over and he has to sort of work himself out. And he's going to have some sort of semi-redemption arc. But then randomly in the third book, Fenno runs into Dippler, who he had bullied early in the story. And then he's just becomes like a bad guy in a video game. And he's like, I'm going to kill you, Dippler. And Dippler's like, no, I'm going to avenge my chief. And then Dippler wins the battle. And it's not poetic at all. Brian Jakes had done 2/3 of the work of developing Fenno as an interesting character. And then he just throws him in for an action scene. So, as has been the pattern with a lot of these books, it's just hard to read Brian Jakes's intention sometimes. He could have just had Fenno be a character who appeared in a few scenes, but he really develops Fenno, and similarly, he develops the dynamics where most of the Marlfoxes have some good in them. They're like a real family, and he like half cares about that, but then he just ends things kind of abruptly, as if that moral complexity never happened. I'm realizing now I forgot a huge detail. Why is this book called Marlfox instead of, as I proposed, an alternative title, Logalog? What makes them Marlfoxes and not just foxes? Well, there's this rumor that the foxes are magic, and they sort of use this to intimidate other creatures into joining their army. And there's even the suggestion that some of the rats who fight for them aren't even evil. They're just terrified of the fox's magic. But once again, we see Brian Jakes doing something enough to make it kind of interesting, but only half committing to it. And I think it's this impulse he has to create these characters, who I again call the skippers, these kind of good characters who are perfect without even being the main good characters. So basically, none of the good characters fall for the trick that the Marlfoxes are magic. And because none of the good characters are tricked by it, there's not really room to do too much with it in the plot. So it just feels like this gimmick at the beginning, and pretty quickly, no, these are just foxes with gray fur and axes, nothing special about them. Whereas I feel like there's some draft of this that was somewhere in Brian Jakes' head where the foxes actually like created complex illusions, and Redwall was genuinely intimidated by this threat of magic Marlfoxes. So overall, Marlfox is the 11th book in a series where all the books try to have a lot of things in common. Brian Jakes was certainly known for his repetitiveness. I feel like the characters are rich enough in this one that if someone were to pick this up as the one Redwall book they read, it would give them a pretty good Redwall experience. But I still feel like it's a tier below in quality the sort of very best books in the series, books like Salamandastron, Martin the Warrior, and The Outcast of Redwall. But let me know your comments about Marlfox below, and I look forward to making a video on The Legend of Luke, the next book in the series, sometime in the near future.